Let the day's noise fall away for a moment. Let your breathing settle. Tonight, we are going to step back nearly 200 years to a world where staying warm through the night was not a matter of adjusting a thermostat, but a practiced skill that made the difference between waking and not waking at all. Picture a valley deep in the Rocky Mountains in the winter of 1825. Snow lies 8 feet deep in the timber. The temperature has fallen to 20 degrees below zero. Darkness comes early around 4:30 in the afternoon, and it will last 14 hours. In a small log cabin built tight against the hillside, a man works alone, gathering firewood, banking coals, preparing his bedding. He is a fur trapper, a mountain man, and this cabin, no larger than a modern bedroom, will be his entire world until spring. He has no neighbors, no town within a week's travel, no one coming to check on him. How did men like him survive the long winter nights in such isolation? How did they stay warm when the cold pressed in from every side, and the only heat came from wood they cut themselves? What did their cabins look like, and what did they do in those hours between sunset and dawn? These are not dramatic questions. They are practical ones, and the answers lie in the details, small decisions, careful routines, and a deep knowledge of how cold moves, how fire burns, and how a human body holds warmth in a place where winter does not forgive. Learning the trade from those who had survived it. The work demanded physical endurance, wading through icy streams to set traps, hauling loads of pelts across high passes, surviving on limited food in country that offered little mercy. Few men continued the lifestyle past 40. It wore them down, or it killed them, or they moved on to something less harsh. These were men like Jim Bridger, who entered the fur trade as a teenager and spent decades in the mountains. Jedediah Smith, who explored vast sections of the West and survived a grizzly bear mauling that tore half his scalp away. Hugh Glass, left for dead after another bear attack, who crawled 200 miles to the nearest outpost. John Coulter, who escaped captivity and ran barefoot through freezing wilderness. Their names became part of frontier legend, but they were also practical men doing hard work in a landscape that required constant attention. Many were of mixed heritage. American-born frontiersmen, French-Canadian voyageurs with generations of wilderness knowledge, men of Native American descent who understood the land in ways that newcomers did not. The mountain man lifestyle was never purely one culture or tradition. It borrowed from many, adapted constantly, and depended on learning from those who knew the country best. They did not live in towns. They built cabins far from settlements, often alone, sometimes in pairs or small groups of 3. These cabins served as winter headquarters, places to return to when trapping season was in full swing and the cold made constant movement impossible. A man might use the same cabin for several winters, or he might build a new one each year depending on where the beaver were, where the water ran, and where he could find timber and game. Winter was the prime trapping season. Beaver fur grew thickest in the coldest months, which meant the most valuable pelts came from November through March. So while settlers and farmers hunkered down and waited for spring, mountain men worked through the freeze. They checked trap lines, skinned animals, stretched hides, and returned each night to a cabin that might be the only human structure for 30 miles in any direction. This isolation was total. No neighbors, no general store, no doctor, If something went wrong, if a man injured himself, if illness struck, if his food supplies ran out, there was no one to turn to. He survived on what he knew and what he carried. Help was not coming. Communication with the outside world came once a year during summer rendezvous, large gatherings where trapped self-reliance so complete it is difficult to imagine now. A broken axe handle meant carving a new one. An empty food cache meant hunting in deep snow. A failed fire meant cold that could kill. And night came early in winter, by 4:30 in the afternoon in the high country, leaving 14 hours of darkness to manage with nothing but firelight and the warmth a man could generate or trap. This was the world they chose, or at least the world they entered, and then found themselves committed to. Winter in the Rockies was not endured passively. It required preparation, skill, and constant small actions that added up to survival. The men who stayed warm through those long nights did so because they understood cold, not as an abstract danger, but as a physical force with rules that could be studied and countered. They built their cabins with care. They gathered wood in quantities that seem excessive until you calculate what it takes to keep fire alive for 14 hours. They wore layers, managed moisture, and structured their evenings around the certainty that warmth, once lost, was hard to reclaim. Before we can understand what they did at night, we need to understand where they were doing it. The Rocky Mountain winter was not like winter anywhere most people lived. It was colder, longer, more isolating, and far less forgiving. The Rocky Mountains in winter were a place where temperature, altitude, and isolation combined into something harsher than the sum of those parts. To understand how mountain men stayed warm at night, you first need to understand what cold meant in that landscape. Temperatures regularly dropped to 20 below zero Fahrenheit. In some valleys and during particularly brutal stretches, they fell to 40 below. This was not the temperature in town with buildings breaking the wind and people nearby. This was the temperature in open wilderness at 7,000 or 9,000 feet of elevation, where the air was thinner and the cold sank into the valleys like water pooling in low ground. Wind made it worse. A steady 15-mile-per-hour wind at 20 below zero created conditions equivalent to 50 below. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Lungs burned with each breath. The body lost heat faster than it could generate it unless a person was moving hard or had found shelter and fire. Snow began falling in October, sometimes earlier. By December, accumulation in the mountain valleys often reached 6 feet. In heavy winters, it reached 12. This snow did not melt until April or May. It buried game trails, covered trap lines, and turned simple travel into exhausting work. A man on foot without snowshoes might sink to his waist with every step. Movement became so costly in terms of energy that staying close to the cabin often made more sense than venturing far. The high altitude intensified everything. Most mountain man cabins were built between 6,000 and 10,000 feet elevation. At that height, the body worked harder to do simple tasks. Breathing required more effort. Exertion brought fatigue faster. Wounds healed more slowly, and the cold, already severe, felt even more penetrating because the thinner air provided less insulation. Storms arrived suddenly. A clear morning could turn into a whiteout by noon. These blizzards sometimes lasted for days. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Snow fell so thickly that tracks disappeared within minutes. The wind howled without pause, and anyone caught outside could become disoriented within yards of their cabin. Men died within sight of shelter, because they could not see it through the snow. Then came the silence. After a storm passed, the landscape fell into a stillness so profound that it felt almost physical. No wind, no birdsong, no distant sounds of human activity. Just the creak of snow settling, the occasional crack of a freezing tree, and the soft thump of snow sliding off a branch. Some men found this silence peaceful. Others found it unnerving, too complete, too empty, a reminder of how alone they were. Winter nights were long. In December and January, darkness lasted 14 hours. The sun set by 4:30 in the afternoon and did not rise again until after 6:30 the next morning. This was not the darkness of a modern night softened by street lights and lit windows. This was total darkness, the kind where a man could not see his hand in front of his face unless fire provided light. The cold followed a pattern. Temperatures dropped steadily through the afternoon, reaching their lowest point in the hours just before dawn. A cabin that felt tolerably warm at sunset might be brutally cold by 5 in the morning. This meant warmth was not a static condition. It had to be maintained, adjusted, fed with wood and effort throughout the night. Historical climate research suggests that the period from 1810 to 1840, the peak years of the Mountain Man era, fell partly within the tail end of the Little Ice Age. This was a centuries-long stretch of cooler global temperatures that made winters more severe than modern averages. Trappers in the 1820s and 1830s experienced cold that was, on average, harsher than what we see in the same regions today. Journals and letters from the time describe the conditions in plain terms. One trapper wrote of waking to find his beard frozen to his blanket. Another described water freezing within minutes of being poured. A third noted that his rifle, left leaning against the cabin wall overnight, was too cold to handle without cloth wrapped around the metal. These were not exaggerations for effect. They were observations of daily reality. The cold did specific things to the body. Fingers and toes went numb first, ears burned, cheeks stung, breath froze on beards and collars, forming ice that clung until warmth melted it. Prolonged exposure brought shivering, then confusion, then a dangerous drowsiness that could lead to death if a person stopped moving or failed to find warmth. But the mountain men were not caught by surprise. They knew what they were entering. They had spent enough time in the high country to understand what winter meant there. The question was never whether it would be cold. The question was whether they had prepared well enough to survive it. That preparation began with the cabin, where it was placed, how it was built, and how effectively it could trap and hold heat. The location of a man's winter shelter determined whether he would sleep comfortably or spend every night fighting for warmth. A poor choice made in the summer or fall could not be undone once snow had fallen and deep cold had set in. A mountain man standing in the wilderness in September looking for a place to build was making a decision that his future self, shivering in January darkness, would either thank him for or curse him for. Every detail mattered. A mountain man arriving in September at a new trapping territory faced a decision that would determine whether he survived until spring. Where to build the cabin mattered more than how well he built it. A poorly chosen location meant fighting the cold every night. A well-chosen one gave him a foundation for survival that required less constant effort. The selection process began with water. A trapper needed to be near a creek or stream, close enough to reach it daily, but far enough that spring flooding wouldn't threaten the cabin. Water meant drinking, cooking, and washing. It also indicated beaver colonies upstream or downstream, the reason for being in that valley at all. But winter complicated everything. A creek that flowed freely in autumn might freeze solid by December, requiring the trapper to chop through thickening ice each morning. Still, proximity to water wasn't optional. The alternative was melting snow, which worked, but consumed firewood and time. Timber came next. The cabin itself required logs, but that was a one-time need. Firewood was a daily necessity from October through April. A trapper burning wood every night for 6 months would go through cords of it. Hauling logs hundreds of yards through deep snow was exhausting, dangerous work. The cabin needed to sit near standing dead trees, already dried, ready to burn, and near living forest that could supply a winter's worth of fuel without clearing so much land that he lost the forest's windbreak effect. Wind killed faster than cold alone. A cabin built on an exposed ridge or in an open meadow faced the full force of winter storms that swept down from higher elevations. These winds didn't just make the air feel colder. They found every gap in the walls, every imperfect seal, and pulled heat from the cabin continuously. The trappers who survived multiple winters learned to build where the land itself provided protection. The ideal location sat on a hillside or in a valley with a rock face, ridgeline, or dense forest to the north. Prevailing winds in the Rockies came from that direction, carrying Arctic air southward. A natural barrier, stone or thick timber, blocked the worst of it. The cabin itself became a secondary defense, but the land did the primary work. Southern exposure mattered just as much. A cabin facing south received whatever winter sunlight existed. At 8,000 or 9,000 feet elevation, that sunlight was weak and the days were short, but even limited solar warming made a difference. The south-facing wall absorbed heat during the brief daylight hours. The interior temperature might rise 5 or 10 degrees simply from sun hitting the logs. That meant less firewood burned, less time spent gathering it, and a cabin that felt slightly less hostile when the trapper returned from checking his trap line. Some men built near existing Native American trails or mountain passes. This wasn't about convenience. A trapper working a remote valley didn't need road access. It was psychological. Knowing that the trail existed, that it connected to something beyond the immediate few square miles provided a mental anchor. Winter isolation wore on the mind as much as the body. A trail meant the possibility of human contact, even if that contact never came. The location also needed to be defensible, but not obvious. Relations with different tribes varied. Some trappers traded and lived peacefully near native groups. Others faced hostility, justified or not. A cabin built in plain view from a ridgeline or open valley could be spotted from miles away. One tucked into a stand of trees or against a hillside blended into the landscape. This wasn't paranoia. It was acknowledgement that a lone man in winter, weakened by cold and possibly by hunger, couldn't defend himself effectively against a group. Better to not be found. Water, timber, wind protection, southern light, and terrain that offered concealment. A trapper might spend days walking a valley or drainage, assessing these factors before choosing where to set his foundation logs. The decision once made was final. Moving a half-built cabin because the location proved poor wasn't possible. Neither was abandoning it in January to build elsewhere. Men who chose poorly suffered through the winter. Their cabins were colder, requiring more firewood. They spent more time exposed to weather while gathering that wood. They woke more often at night as wind stripped heat from their shelter. Some survived, others didn't. Bodies were occasionally found in spring, frozen in cabins that should have been adequate, but were positioned where the wind or the distance from resources created a slow accumulation of problems that became fatal. Men who chose well still faced a hard winter, but the land worked with them instead of against them. The cabin stayed warmer with less effort. Firewood lasted longer. The daily tasks of survival took less time, leaving more energy for the actual work of trapping. The difference wasn't comfort. It was the margin between manageable hardship and a struggle that consumed everything. Once the site was chosen, construction began with an understanding that size was the enemy of warmth. A mountain man didn't build a spacious cabin. He built the smallest structure that could hold him, his gear, and a fireplace. 12 feet by 14 feet was common. Some went smaller, 10 by 12. The goal wasn't living space, it was a container for heat. Small cabins had practical advantages beyond warmth. They required less time to build, which mattered when snow could arrive by October. They used less timber, which meant less cutting and hauling. They were easier to chink thoroughly because there were fewer gaps to seal. And critically, they could be heated by a single fire. A larger cabin might feel more comfortable in concept, but it would remain cold in practice, no matter how much wood burned. The first logs laid were the largest and straightest the trapper could manage, foundation pieces that would bear the weight of everything above. These sat directly on the ground or on flat stones if he took the time to place them. Raising the cabin on stone piers kept the bottom logs from rotting as quickly, but many trappers skipped this step. A cabin only needed to last a few winters. Permanence wasn't the objective. Pine, spruce, or fir made up most cabin walls depending on what grew nearby. The trapper selected trees, felled them, and limbed them on site. Some men stripped the bark before construction. This prevented insect infestation and helped the logs dry more evenly. Others left bark on initially, planning to remove it later, or simply accepting that bugs would move in. Speed often trumped ideal practice. Log length determined cabin size. Cutting logs to precise dimensions with an axe and saw took time. Most trappers cut them slightly longer than needed, letting the ends protrude past the corner joints. These protruding ends weren't decorative, they were evidence of efficiency. Cutting them flush served no survival purpose. Corners used a saddle notch or a simple V-notch, locking each log to the one beneath and the one that would sit above. No nails. Nails were expensive, heavy to transport, and unavailable in remote territories anyway. The notches themselves held the structure together. A well-cut notch was tight enough that the log didn't shift, but not so tight that it cracked the wood below. The walls rose in courses, each log stacked on the last. The work required both strength and precision. A single man could lift and position smaller logs alone. Larger ones required leverage, using a ramp of smaller poles or a notched skid log to roll the timber up and into place. Progress was slow. A trapper, working alone, might raise only 4 or 5 courses in a day. As the walls climbed past waist-height gaps between logs became visible, No two logs were perfectly straight or perfectly round. Even tightly fitted, spaces remained. Some narrow enough to see light through, others wide enough to admit wind. These gaps would be chinked later, but the trapper kept them in mind as he worked, sometimes rotating a log to minimize the worst openings. Wall height was deliberate. Most cabins stopped at 6.5 or 7 feet, tall enough for a man to stand, but no taller. Extra height meant more wall surface to lose heat through, more interior space to warm, and more logs to cut and stack. Low ceilings trapped warm air near the floor and sleeping platform. Heat rose, and a low roof meant it didn't rise far before spreading horizontally. The result was a cramped interior, but one that stayed warmer. The roof structure began once the walls reached full height. Lighter poles, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, were laid across the top of the side walls, spaced less than a foot apart. These formed the roof's framework. On top of them went layers of bark, large sheets if available, smaller pieces if not, arranged like shingles to shed water and snow. Pine boughs went on next, then a layer of earth or sod. The entire assembly might be 10 or 12 inches thick when complete. This roof wasn't waterproof by modern standards, but it didn't need to be. Snow was dry, it piled up on the roof through winter, and that snowpack became insulation, cold but still. The earth and bough layers beneath kept wind from blowing through. Meltwater or rain would drip through in spring, but by then the trapper was usually outside more than in. The door opening was cut small, often only 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. A man had to duck and turn slightly to enter. This wasn't an oversight. A small door lost less heat when opened and closed. It was easier to block with a heavy hide or blanket at night. And it was easier to defend if needed, though most trappers hoped that scenario never arrived. Some cabins had a single small window, others had none. A window provided light, but it also provided cold. Glass was impossible to transport into remote mountains. Alternatives included scraped animal hide stretched thin enough to let light through, or oiled paper if the trapper had carried it in. Many chose darkness over cold and left the walls solid except for the door. The fireplace was built into one wall, usually the north wall, so the main living space faced south. Stone was best for this, if flat pieces could be found nearby. Clay mixed with sand and gravel also worked, though it cracked more easily. The firebox was wide enough to fit logs 2 or 3 feet long and deep enough that coals could build up over weeks of burning. The chimney rose inside the wall, then exited through the roof. Its construction required patience. A chimney that drew poorly filled the cabin with smoke. One that drew too well pulled heat straight out of the structure. When the last log was set and the roof sealed, the cabin was still unfinished. Gaps between every log needed chinking, the door needed hinges or a leather strap system, the interior needed a sleeping platform, storage, and the constant adjustments that turned a structure into a shelter. But the walls were up. The roof kept weather out, the fireplace was ready to burn, the frame of winter survival stood complete. A log cabin in the wilderness was never truly finished. It stood, yes. It provided walls and a roof, but between each horizontal log lay a gap, sometimes narrow, sometimes the width of 2 fingers, and through those gaps the winter wind would find its way. Cold air moved through cracks with surprising force. It found every unsealed space. A cabin with gaps was only slightly warmer than standing outside with a windbreak. The difference between a survivable winter and a deadly one often came down to how well a man sealed the spaces between his logs. The work was called chinking. It meant filling every gap, every crack, every space where two logs didn't meet perfectly flush. The logs themselves were solid, hand-cut pine or spruce, often as thick as a man's torso, but wood was never uniform. Trees grew with irregularities. One log might have a curve, another might taper slightly along its length. Where they stacked, they left voids. Chinking happened in stages. The exterior gaps were addressed first, usually in autumn, before the first snows. A man worked his way around the cabin, studying each seam, determining what it needed. Some gaps were tight enough that moss alone would suffice. Others required more. Moss was gathered from the forest floor in late summer. It grew thick on the north sides of trees and in damp hollows where sunlight barely reached. A trapper would collect it in armfuls, bringing back as much as he could carry. It was surprisingly effective, dense, fibrous, and when pressed tightly into a gap, it created a barrier against wind. Moss alone was rarely enough. It needed something to hold it in place and seal around it. Mud became the binder. Not just any mud, it needed clay content to dry hard and hold through freeze-thaw cycles. A man would dig clay-rich soil from a creek bank or a hillside seep, mix it with water until it reached a thick, workable consistency, and pack it around the moss. The process was methodical. Press moss into the gap first, then apply mud over it, forcing it into every remaining space. Smooth the surface so water would run off, rather than pooling and freezing. Some men improved the mixture. Animal hair, gathered from buffalo hides during skinning or saved from deer and elk, could be mixed into the mud. The hair acted like reinforcement, much the way straw reinforced adobe in warmer climates. It gave the dried chinking more tensile strength, made it less likely to crack when temperatures dropped and the logs contracted slightly. Clay, where available, was superior to plain mud. It dried harder. It resisted crumbling. A man who found a good clay deposit would return to it repeatedly, gathering enough to chink his entire cabin properly. Clay chinking, when well applied, could last an entire winter without significant repair. But even the best chinking cracked. Winter was not gentle. Temperatures that swung from 20 degrees during the day to 20 below at night caused expansion and contraction. The logs moved, barely perceptibly, but enough. A hairline crack would appear in the chinking, then another. By midwinter, a well-chinked cabin would still need touch-up work. Interior chinking mattered as much as exterior, perhaps more. The inside surface of the wall faced the greatest temperature difference. Warm air inside, cold air outside. The differential could be 60 degrees or more. Wherever the seal failed, cold air pushed through. A man could feel it as a draft across his hands or face. Finding and sealing those interior gaps became an ongoing task through the winter months. The work was done by firelight in the evening or on storm days when going outside was impossible. A trapper would walk the perimeter of his cabin's interior, hand extended, feeling for the telltale cold stream of air that indicated a crack. When he found one, he would mix a small amount of mud, kept soft in a container near the fire, and press it into place. In the most remote locations where even mud was hard to come by during deep winter, men improvised. Snow, packed tightly into a gap from the outside, could serve as temporary chinking. It insulated surprisingly well as long as it stayed frozen. The risk was a midday thaw followed by evening refreeze, which could create ice that expanded and pushed logs apart slightly. But in an emergency, when wind was howling through a crack and no other material was available, packed snow was better than nothing. Chinking was never a task that ended. It was maintenance. A man who sealed his cabin well in October would still find himself pressing mud into cracks in January. The process became part of the rhythm of winter life, not daily but regular. Walk the walls, feel for drafts, repair what needed repair. A well-chinked cabin was noticeably warmer. The difference was not dramatic in absolute terms, but dramatic in terms of survival. Instead of frigid air constantly moving through the space, the air became still. Stillness allowed the fire's heat to accumulate rather than being immediately carried away. The cabin wouldn't be warm by modern standards, but it would be warm enough. 40 degrees instead of 20, 50 near the fire instead of 30. Those degrees mattered. The best trappers took pride in tight chinking. It was a mark of craft, of care, of understanding that survival in the mountains was built on small details done well. A man could have the thickest walls and the largest fireplace, but if he left gaps unsealed, he would wake shivering in the middle of the night, feeding the fire more often, burning through his woodpile faster, and feeling the cold in his bones. Sealing every gap was not glamorous work. It was repetitive, time-consuming, and had to be done while crouched or kneeling for hours. But it was absolutely necessary. The materials were simple: moss, mud, clay, animal hair, elements gathered from the immediate surroundings. The technique was straightforward: pack tightly, seal completely, check regularly. What made the difference was the understanding that this work mattered as much as any other aspect of winter preparation. The trappers who survived decades in the mountains understood that. The ones who didn't sometimes learned too late or not at all. The fireplace was not one element among many. It was the center. Every other aspect of the cabin's design oriented around it. The sleeping platform was positioned to benefit from its warmth. The door was placed to avoid downdrafts that would interfere with the fire's draw. The single window, if there was one, was located to allow light without creating cross breezes that would pull heat up the chimney too quickly. The fireplace kept a man alive. Without it, the cabin was just a box of logs. With it, the cabin became survivable. Construction began with the fireplace, often before the walls were fully raised. A man needed to know exactly where it would sit, how large it would be, and how the chimney would rise, because those decisions affected everything else. The location was almost always on the north wall, if the cabin's orientation allowed it. This kept the coldest wall, the one facing away from the sun, occupied by stone or clay mass that would absorb and radiate heat inward. Stone was the preferred material. A good fireplace required flat stones for the base, angular stones for the sides, and carefully selected pieces for the firebox itself. The stones needed to withstand intense, repeated heating without cracking. Sandstone was too soft, shale split too easily, granite and other hard, dense stones were ideal. A man would spend days searching creek beds and rocky outcrops, gathering stones, testing them by heating them in a small fire to see if they fractured. The firebox, the chamber where the actual fire burned, was built large, 2 to 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and at least 18 inches tall. A small firebox required constantly feeding small pieces of wood. A large firebox could accept logs the length of a man's arm, thick as his thigh, that would burn for hours. The size determined how often the fire needed attention during the night. Building the firebox required care. The stones were stacked without mortar in many cases. Mountain men didn't always have access to lime for proper mortar, so they relied on tight-fitting stones and clay packed into gaps. The back wall of the firebox was angled slightly forward. This reflected heat out into the room rather than allowing it to go straight up the chimney. The angle was subtle, perhaps 10 degrees, but it made a measurable difference in how much warmth reached the cabin's interior. The chimney presented the greatest challenge. It needed to draw, to pull smoke upward and out, creating a draft that fed air into the fire. A chimney that didn't draw properly would fill the cabin with smoke, making it uninhabitable. The chimney's height mattered. It needed to extend above the roofline by at least 2 feet, preferably 3, to catch wind and create suction. The interior passage needed to be wide enough to allow smoke to rise, but not so wide that heat escaped wastefully. In areas where stone was scarce, men built chimneys from logs covered in thick clay. This was dangerous. If the clay cracked and exposed the wood, the chimney could catch fire. But in the absence of stone, it was the only option. The logs were stacked in a square formation and clay was applied in layers, each layer drying before the next was added until the wood was encased in several inches of baked earth. A poorly constructed chimney could kill. Smoke inhalation was a real risk. Carbon monoxide, invisible and odorless, could build up in a cabin with inadequate ventilation. Men had died in their sleep from it. The trappers who survived learned to test the draw before relying on a fireplace for an entire winter. They would build a small fire and watch the smoke. If it rose cleanly and exited without filling the cabin, the chimney worked. If smoke lingered or pooled along the ceiling, something was wrong. The chimney was too short, the passage was blocked, or the design was flawed. Once the fireplace was built and proven functional, it became the reference point for everything. The area directly in front of it was the warmest zone in the cabin. This was where a man sat to work on equipment, where he cooked, where he dried wet clothing. A log or stump often served as a seat, positioned close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to avoid sparks. Some trappers built a reflector, a wall of stacked stone opposite the fireplace, several feet away. This wall absorbed radiant heat and threw it back toward the center of the room, creating a warm pocket between the fireplace and the reflector. Not every cabin had one, but those that did were noticeably warmer in the core living space. Fire management was constant. A fire was started in the morning and maintained until bedtime. The flame varied in intensity depending on need: high flames for cooking, lower, steadier flames for ambient heat. The fire was never allowed to die completely during waking hours. Relighting it was time-consuming and wasted resources. Instead, it was fed incrementally. A piece of wood added when the flames began to diminish. The type of wood mattered. Softwoods like pine and spruce burned hot and fast, useful for cooking or quickly warming a cold cabin. Hardwoods like oak or ash, when available, burned slower and produced long-lasting coals. A mix was ideal. Start with softwood for immediate heat, then add hardwood to sustain it. At night, the fire was banked. This meant building it up with the largest logs available, pieces too big to catch fire quickly, and arranging them so they would burn slowly from one end. Coals were raked around the base of these logs. The goal was for the fire to smoulder through the night, maintaining coals that could be revived in the morning without needing to start from scratch. But banking was imperfect. A fire banked at 8 in the evening might hold coals until 2 in the morning, sometimes later, sometimes not. Temperature, wood moisture, the specific type of wood, the size of the logs, all of it affected how long the coals lasted. Many nights a trapper woke in darkness to add wood. This was expected. It was part of the rhythm. The cold would wake him, or the dimming glow of the coals, and he would rise, add a log, and return to his furs. If the fire went out completely during a bitter cold night, relighting it was difficult. Hands stiffened in the cold. Kindling had to be carefully arranged. Flint and steel required dry tinder and steady hands. Some men kept a small ember in a covered clay pot, insulated with ash as a backup. The ember could survive for hours and be blown back to flame more easily than starting fresh. The fireplace demanded respect. It provided everything, but it also consumed constantly. Wood, attention, time. A man who let his fire die carelessly, or who failed to gather sufficient wood before a storm, paid for that lapse with cold and difficulty. The fireplace was both servant and master. It kept the cabin livable, but only if the man kept it fed. The work of staying warm began long before the sun dropped behind the peaks. It began in late afternoon, when light still held, when a man could still see the woodpile and judge what remained. Firewood was not gathered casually. It was gathered with intention, with an understanding that what came inside now would determine the quality of the night ahead. A mountain man learned to read his supply. He learned what a night required. On a still evening when temperatures might drop to 10 below, he needed one amount. On a night when wind screamed through the valley and the cold pushed past 20 below, he needed more. Experience taught estimation, a glance at the sky, a feel of the wind, a memory of how the last cold night had burned through the pile. He stepped outside in mid-afternoon while daylight remained strong. The woodpile stood near the cabin, within easy reach, but far enough that falling snow would not bury the entrance. Some men kept their wood under a rough shelter of bark and poles. Others simply stacked it high and let the top layers take the snow, while the lower rows stayed dry enough. The wood itself mattered. He did not grab randomly, he selected with purpose. Small pieces first, kindling, thin splits the width of a wrist, dry and quick to catch. These would start the evening fire or restart it if it burned too low in the night. He gathered an armful of these pieces no longer than his forearm and carried them inside to stack near the hearth. Then medium logs, arm-thick sections of pine or spruce, split cleanly, their surfaces still showing the marks of the axe. These burned steadily once lit, neither too fast nor too slow. They gave sustained heat for hours, the kind of heat that filled the small cabin and soaked into the log walls. He carried these inside in several trips, stacking them within reach of where he would sit, where he would sleep, where he could feed the fire without fully leaving his bedding. Finally, the backlogs, heavy sections, sometimes unsplit rounds if they were dry enough, as thick as a man's thigh, or larger. These were the insurance. A backlog placed at the rear of a fire would burn slowly through the night, holding coals for 6 or 8 hours. It was the difference between waking to warmth and waking to cold darkness. He chose one or two of these carefully, hefted them inside, positioned them where they would be easy to roll into place when the time came. Each type of wood served a different need. Each had a role in the architecture of an all-night fire. The wood needed to be dry. Wet wood, even slightly damp wood, burned poorly. It smoked, it hissed, it consumed heat rather than producing it. Wood brought in with snows on it was stacked near the fire first, allowed to dry for an hour or more before being used. The heat of the existing fire drew moisture out. Steam rose from damp bark. The wood lightened as water left it. A man learned which trees burned best. Pine and spruce lit easily and burned hot, but fast. Fir burned cleaner, with less smoke. Aspen, if available, burned quickly and was good for cooking but poor for overnight heat. Cottonwood, dense and stubborn, gave steady heat, but was harder to split and took longer to catch. The best firewood came from standing dead trees, already dried by seasons of weathering, their bark loose or gone, their wood seasoned by sun and wind. He had cut most of his winter supply in autumn, felled trees, limbed them, sectioned the trunks into manageable lengths, split what needed splitting, and stacked it all to continue drying. But through winter, the work continued. Dead branches could be harvested. Fallen timber, if found and accessible, could be dragged back and processed. A mountain man was never truly finished with firewood. He was only ever maintaining a supply. Inside the cabin now, the wood stood ready, kindling in a pile near the hearth, medium split stacked against the wall within arm's reach. The heavy backlog resting on the floor where it could be rolled into the fire when the evening meal was done and the serious cold of night arrived. This was the currency of winter, not pelts, not supplies, not even food. Wood. Enough wood meant warmth, enough wood meant sleep, enough wood meant waking alive when dawn returned. Running short was dangerous. If a storm came and lasted 3 days, a man might burn through his indoor supply and face a choice: go outside in blizzard conditions to retrieve more, or let the fire die and endure cold that could kill. The solution was always the same: bring in more than seemed necessary, stack it where the snow could not bury it, maintain a surplus. Some men kept a strict routine. Every afternoon, no matter the weather, they carried in the night's supply. Others waited until the pile inside looked low, then made a large haul. But no experienced man let the indoor stack run out completely. That was the mistake of someone still learning. A man who had survived one winter knew better. The physical work of moving firewood was constant, carrying load after load from outside to inside, stacking it carefully so it would not roll or fall, keeping pathways clear so that in full darkness, half asleep, he could still reach what he needed. This labour was not dramatic, it was simply necessary. The cabin now held the raw material of warmth. The wood waited, potential energy stored in cellulose and lignin waiting for flame to release it. The man had done his part. He had gathered, hauled, stacked and prepared. The rest would depend on how well he built the fire, how carefully he fed it, and whether he woke when the cold required it. Outside, the light was fading. The temperature would drop with the sun. Inside, the wood stood ready. Building a fire that would last through a winter night was not a matter of piling on logs and hoping. It was a process, a structure, a careful arrangement of wood in stages, each type serving a different phase of the long hours between dusk and dawn. The mountain man knelt before the fireplace as evening settled. The fire from the day's cooking still held coals, glowing dull orange beneath a layer of ash. He did not start from nothing. He built on what remained. First, he cleared space. He used a stick or a crude iron poker to push aside ash, exposing the hottest coals beneath. These coals, if still alive, would ignite kindling without the need for flint and steel. Saving coals saved effort. He learned to keep some burning through every waking hour so that restarting was only a matter of feeding, not rekindling. He placed kindling across the coals, thin splits, bark, small dry twigs if he had them. He did not pile them in a heap. He laid them loosely, allowing air to flow between the pieces. Fire needed air as much as it needed fuel. He arranged the kindling in a rough pyramid or a loose crosshatch, spacing the pieces so flame could climb and spread. The kindling caught. Flames licked upward, small and yellow, brightening the interior of the fireplace. The cabin filled with the sound of crackling, the sharp scent of burning pine resin. The flames grew, fed by the dry wood, and the heat began to push outward into the room. Now he added the next layer, medium logs, arm-thick sections of split pine or fir. He did not throw them on carelessly. He placed them deliberately. 2 or 3 logs laid across the burning kindling, positioned so they would catch from the flames below but not smother them. The logs needed to rest on the kindling, not crush it. Weight mattered. Placement mattered. The medium logs began to burn. Their surfaces blackened. Flames wrapped around them, flowing upward toward the chimney. The fire grew hotter. The cabin warmed. This was the fire's active phase, the time when it gave the most heat, when the small space filled with warmth that soaked into clothing and skin and log walls. He let this fire burn for a time, through the evening meal, through the final tasks of the day, through the hours when light outside faded completely and darkness pressed against the cabin's single window. The medium logs burned steadily, giving sustained heat, and the interior temperature rose to something almost comfortable. But medium logs would not last the night. They burned too fast. By midnight, they would be coals. By dawn, they would be ash. This was where the backlog became essential. When the evening fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, and the medium logs had been reduced to blackened, half-consumed pieces, he added the heavy wood. The backlog, a section of trunk as thick as a man's thigh, sometimes thicker, unsplit or only partially split, dense, dry enough to burn but slowly. He rolled the backlog into position. It went at the back of the fireplace against the rear wall of stone or clay, where it would catch heat from the coals in front of it. He did not expect it to burst into flame. It would not. It would smoulder. It would burn from the outside inward, slowly, across hours. The outer surface would char and glow. The interior would remain solid, releasing heat gradually as the wood broke down. This was the architecture of a night fire. Fast kindling to establish flame, medium logs to build heat and coals, a heavy backlog to hold those coals and sustain them through darkness. If built correctly, this fire would burn in stages. The flames would die down after an hour or two, but the coals would remain. The backlog would keep those coals alive, glowing red-orange in the dark, radiating heat, even without visible flame. The cabin would not stay warm, but it would not become deadly cold. The temperature would drop, but slowly. A mountain man learned to judge the fire before sleep. He looked at the coals. He assessed the backlog. He estimated how many hours it would hold. If the wood was good and the backlog thick enough, he might sleep 4 or 5 hours before needing to wake and add more. But if the night was brutal, if the wind howled and the cold pushed deep below zero, even the best backlog might not be enough. He would wake. He would know by the feel of the air against his face, by the cold creeping under the furs, that the fire needed feeding. Waking to feed the fire was not failure. It was expected. Part of the rhythm of winter nights, he rose from the bedding, moving carefully in the darkness. The cabin was black except for the faint glow of coals in the fireplace. He did not light a candle. His eyes adjusted enough to see the dull red outline of embers. He reached for wood, stacked nearby, found a medium log by touch and placed it onto the coals. The log rested on the glowing bed. For a moment, nothing. Then small flames appeared where wood touched coal. The flames grew. The log began to burn. Heat increased. The cabin warmed slightly. He did not stay awake. He returned to the bedding, pulled the furs close, and slept again. This cycle repeated. Sleep, wake, feed the fire, sleep. The night passed in intervals, not as a single unbroken rest. This was normal. This was winter. By dawn the fire would be low again. Coals remained if the night had been managed well. If not, the fireplace held only ash, and the work of rekindling began again, with flint and steel and patience. The fire through darkness was a system. It required preparation, attention, and the willingness to interrupt sleep. It required understanding how wood burned, how long different pieces lasted, how to balance immediate heat against sustained warmth. A mountain man who mastered this system stayed warm enough to survive. One who did not learn quickly, or did not survive to learn at all. The flames rose and fell, the coals glowed and dimmed. The night continued, and the fire, carefully built and carefully tended, held back the cold. The fire that seemed strong at bedtime would not hold through the night. This was not failure. This was the nature of wood and air and hours of darkness. A mountain man built his evening fire with care, stacking logs in a pattern meant to burn slowly, and it would carry heat through the first part of the night. But wood became ash, flame became ember. The cabin that had been warm enough to move without a coat would grow cold while he slept. By midnight, the temperature inside might drop 10 degrees. By the hours before dawn, another 10. The fire that had filled the small space with steady warmth at 8 in the evening would be a bed of coals by 2 in the morning, glowing, but not flaming, radiating less heat with each passing hour. Waking to feed the fire was not a choice. It was built into the rhythm of winter sleep. A man learned to wake without fully surfacing from sleep. The cold would reach him through the layers of fur. Not a sharp cold, but a creeping chill that worked its way into awareness. He would know, even before fully waking, that the fire had burned low. The movement was practiced. Swing legs from beneath the buffalo robe, feel for the floor with feet still wrapped in wool or fur, stand in darkness, broken only by the dim orange glow from the fireplace. Cross the small distance, 3 steps, maybe 4, to the woodpile kept near the hearth. He did not need to see clearly. His hands knew the shape of split logs. He would select 1 or 2 pieces, not too large, and place them onto the coals. Not dropped, placed. The goal was to add fuel without smothering the ember bed that still held heat. If he had prepared well, the coals would still be hot enough to ignite the new wood within minutes. Small flames would lick up the sides of the fresh logs. He might wait just long enough to see the fire catch, to feel the first wave of new heat before returning to the bed platform. The entire process might take 2 minutes, 3 at most. Then back beneath the furs, pulling them close, waiting for the cabin air to warm again before sleep returned. The fire would build. The temperature would rise, and in another 3 or 4 hours the same sequence would repeat. This happened twice each night in moderate cold, 3 times when temperatures outside dropped below 0, 4 times during the coldest snaps, when the wind came down from the high peaks and the cabin walls creaked with frost. Some men developed an internal rhythm. They would wake naturally just as the fire reached the point of needing attention, as if some part of their mind tracked the declining heat, even in sleep. Others woke when the cold became too present to ignore, startled into awareness by the chill against their face or hands. There was no sleeping through the night, uninterrupted. Not in January, not at 8,000 feet, not when a fire left unattended for 6 hours would die to ash, and a cabin without fire would reach the same temperature as the air outside. The alternative to waking was building such a large fire before bed that it would last until morning. But this carried its own risks. A fire too large, too close to bedtime, meant a cabin too hot to sleep in, forcing a man to wait for it to burn down before he could rest. It meant using wood faster, depleting the supply stacked inside, and it meant trusting a large fire to burn safely while unconscious, which experienced men avoided. Better to wake, better to add wood in stages, better to maintain control. The interrupted sleep became normal. A man's rest was divided into segments. The first sleep from bedtime until the first waking, the second sleep between fire feedings, the third after the final addition of wood in the hours before dawn. It was not the deep, unbroken rest of summer nights. It was winter sleep, and it came in pieces. Some men prepared the firewood for night feeding with extra care. They would split pieces to a specific size, easy to grab and place in darkness. They would stack these night logs within arm's reach of the bed, so the walk across cold floor could be shortened. They would position the stack so their hands found it immediately, without searching. This preparation happened in the last hour of daylight, part of the evening routine that determined how the night would unfold. The wood selected for overnight burning was usually a denser hardwood if available, oak or maple brought from lower elevations, or well-seasoned pine that would burn slower than green wood. The goal was steady, lasting heat rather than quick, hot flame. A log the thickness of a man's thigh could burn for 2 hours if placed correctly on a bed of coals. In the darkest part of winter, when nights stretched to 14 hours, a man might wake 4 times between lying down and rising. Each waking was brief, but the cumulative interruption meant that winter sleep was lighter, more alert to temperature and sound than the heavier sleep of warmer months. There were men who spoke of learning to add wood without fully waking, moving through the task in a state between sleep and consciousness, returning to bed with almost no memory of having risen. The body learned the pattern, the movements became automatic, but there were also nights when sleep would not return after feeding the fire. A man would lie beneath furs, listening to the new logs catch and burn, feeling the air warm around him, but unable to slip back into rest. On those nights he might rise again and sit near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames and waiting for drowsiness to return. The night feeding of fire was the price of warmth. Every mountain man who spent winter alone paid it. The floor of a mountain cabin was earth, packed dirt, sometimes frozen solid for months, always cold. A man did not sleep on it. Cold air settled low. This was observable fact. The warmest air in a small cabin rose toward the low ceiling and gathered in the upper portions of the single room. The coldest air sank to the floor and stayed there, heavy and still. On the coldest nights, the difference in temperature between floor level and 3 feet above it could be 10 degrees or more. A bed built at floor level meant sleeping in the coldest layer of air, in the cabin. A bed raised even slightly meant sleeping in warmer air. The difference mattered. Most mountain men constructed a simple sleeping platform from logs or poles. The design was basic, a rectangular frame built against one wall, elevated on supports that raised the sleeping surface 12 to 18 inches above the ground. The frame itself was made from smaller timber, thinner than the logs used for cabin walls, but still substantial. 4 corner posts, each driven into the ground or wedged against the wall, supported 2 long side rails. Crosspieces laid perpendicular to these rails created the base that would hold the bedding materials. No nails. The construction used notches, lashing with rawhide strips, or simple placement where gravity and weight held pieces together. The platform did not need to be movable. It would stay in place through the entire winter. The location of the bed within the cabin was chosen with purpose, far enough from the door to avoid drafts when it opened, positioned to receive heat from the fireplace without being so close that sparks posed danger, usually built against the back wall or a side wall, using the cabin structure itself as part of the frame. Some men built the platform slightly longer than their own height and wider than their shoulders, giving space to shift position during sleep. Others built it more compact, conserving materials and creating a smaller area to keep warm with body heat and furs. The space beneath the platform became storage. It was dim, protected, and more temperate than the open floor. Men stored extra supplies there, sacks of dried goods, additional furs, tools not in regular use, anything that needed to be kept off the frozen ground. The stored materials also provided additional insulation, blocking some of the cold rising from the earth below. Once the platform frame was complete, the sleeping surface itself required construction. The crosspieces alone, bare poles or split logs, would not provide comfort or warmth. They needed layering. The first layer was often pine boughs. If a man built or moved into his cabin in autumn, before heavy snow, he could gather fresh boughs from nearby evergreens. These were laid across the platform in overlapping rows, needles facing up, creating a springy mat several inches thick. Pine boughs compressed under weight but retained some give, preventing the hardness of wood from pressing directly against a sleeping body. They also held air in the spaces between branches and needles. That trapped air provided insulation, a buffer between the sleeper and the cold logs beneath. The boughs had to be gathered in quantity, enough to cover the full platform in a layer thick enough to matter. A man might spend half a day cutting and hauling boughs, making multiple trips between cabin and forest until he had sufficient material. If pine was not available, dried grasses served the same purpose. Meadow grass cut in late summer and dried, then bundled and stored, could be spread across the platform to create a similar insulating layer. It compressed more than pine boughs and needed more frequent replacement, but it was easier to gather in large quantities in certain locations. Some men used both, a base layer of grass with pine boughs on top, combining the insulation of dried vegetation with the slight springiness of evergreen branches. Over the course of a winter, this bottom layer would compress, break down, and lose effectiveness. A man might refresh it in midwinter if conditions allowed him to venture out and gather more material. If not, he would make do with what remained, adding extra furs to compensate for the degraded bedding. Above the boughs or grass, some men placed a layer of hide, an elk skin or deer hide, fur side down, creating a more uniform surface and adding another layer of insulation. This was not always available, as prime furs were more valuable as trade goods or as outer blankets. But when materials allowed, a hide between the boughs and the sleeping furs made the bed more comfortable and warmer. The entire construction, frame, boughs, hides, created a sleeping surface that kept a man off the frozen ground, out of the coldest air, and provided some cushioning against the hardness of wood and earth. It was not soft, but soft was not the goal. Warm was the goal. Survivable was the goal. The platform became a defined place in the small cabin, the location where rest happened, where furs were piled during the day when not in use, where a man retreated when cold or exhaustion made activity impossible. In cabins occupied by two men, sometimes two platforms were built along opposite walls. In cabins shared temporarily by larger groups, men might sleep side by side on a wider platform, sharing body heat as well as furs. But for the solitary mountain man, the single raised bed became the other center of the cabin's geography, opposite the fireplace, fire and bed, heat source and sleeping place, the 2 points around which winter life rotated. The bed frame was built. The sleeping platform stood 18 inches above the floor, solid and bare. Between that plank surface and a sleeping man, there needed to be something. Layers that would prevent body heat from draining directly into cold wood, materials that would cushion and insulate through the long hours of darkness. Before the first heavy snow, while the ground was still accessible and movement through the forest remained practical, a mountain man gathered pine boughs. He cut them from lower branches of fir and spruce trees, selecting growth that was still pliable, not brittle with age. An armload at a time, he brought them back to the cabin. They smelled sharp and clean. The resin left his hands sticky. These boughs were laid across the sleeping platform in overlapping layers, creating a surface that had some give to it, some spring. Not soft, exactly, but not the unforgiving hardness of wood planks. The needles and small branches compressed under weight, forming a kind of mattress that held a thin layer of air within its structure. Air that, once warmed by body heat, stayed relatively still and provided a small buffer against the cold rising from below. The bough layer was typically 4 to 6 inches thick when first laid down. Over weeks of use it compressed further. The needles dried and became brittle. Some fell away. The springiness faded. After a month or two, depending on how much the bed was used, the layer needed attention. If weather permitted and snow depth was manageable, a man might venture out to cut fresh boughs and refresh the bedding. If not, he slept on what remained, accepting the gradual flattening, the slow reduction of that cushioning layer. In some cases, dried grass was used instead of pine boughs or in combination with them. This required preparation in late summer or early autumn. A man would cut tall grass from meadows near his cabin site, gather it in bundles, and spread it in the sun to dry completely. Moisture in the grass would mold and rot. Dry grass, though, could be stored and used. It was laid across the bed platform in thick piles compressed by weight into a reasonably dense mat. It provided insulation, it offered some softness, and it could be turned or rearranged periodically to redistribute wear. The grass mat had one advantage over pine boughs: it could be gathered in quantity and stored inside the cabin before winter began. A corner might hold a reserve supply, loose grass piled and ready to add to the bedding as needed. But it also had a disadvantage. Grass was more prone to absorbing moisture from the air, from breath, from the dampness that sometimes accumulated in small enclosed spaces. Damp grass lost its insulating quality. It became a cold, uncomfortable surface, so it required occasional fluffing, occasional airing near the fire, occasional replacement. The choice between pine boughs and grass was partly practical, partly a matter of local availability. In heavily forested areas at elevation, boughs were abundant. In valley locations near meadows, grass was easier to gather. Some men used both, a base of grass with a top layer of boughs, combining the cushioning of dried stalks with the aromatic resilience of evergreen branches. Either way, this layer was not decorative. It was not about comfort in the way we think of mattresses. It was about survival. It created separation between a man's body and the frozen wood beneath. It trapped air. It reduced the conductive loss of heat. And, though it required maintenance and periodic replacement, it was renewable. A man alone in winter could replenish his bedding from the surrounding forest, if conditions allowed, if he had the energy, if the snow wasn't too deep. The space beneath the bed platform, that 18-inch gap between the sleeping surface and the floor, served another purpose entirely. It became storage. Small barrels of flour or cornmeal, bundles of traps, extra furs not currently in use, sacks of dried meat or beans. Anything that needed to be kept off the frozen ground, protected from the creeping cold that settled at floor level, found a place beneath the bed. This wasn't wasted space. In a cabin, 12 feet by 14 feet, every cubic foot mattered. The sleeping platform did double duty: a place to rest above the cold, and a shelf beneath which essential supplies could be tucked away. It kept the cabin's limited floor area clearer for movement, for the fireplace, for the small tasks of daily life. The bedding base, whether boughs or grass or a combination, was checked regularly. A man would run his hand across it, feeling for thin spots, for areas that had compressed too much. He would shift materials from thicker sections to thinner ones. He would add fresh layers when possible. The bedding was not static. It was maintained, adjusted, managed through the season. On top of this base layer came everything else: wool blankets, animal furs, hides. But without the foundation, without that initial barrier of plant material between man and wood, even the heaviest buffalo robe would have been less effective. Heat would have drained downward. The cold would have crept up from below. The bedding base was the first line of defense, the quiet layer that no one talked about much, but that made every other layer work better. It was gathered in autumn. It was laid with care. It was maintained through winter. And when spring finally came, when the snow melted and warmth returned, The old boughs and grass were cleared out, thrown onto the scrap heap or used as fire kindling. The cycle would begin again the following fall, the same simple preparation, the same essential task. Staying warm started with what lay between man and cold wood. There was a blanket that became synonymous with the frontier, with winter survival, with the fur trade itself. It was produced by the Hudson's Bay Company, traded throughout the mountain west, and valued by trappers as much as powder or lead. It was called a point blanket, named for the short black lines woven into one edge marks that indicated its size and weight. A 4-point blanket measured roughly 6 feet by 8 feet when unfolded. It weighed between 8 and 10 pounds. It was woven from wool, thick and densely constructed, with a napped surface that trapped air and resisted wind. The standard colours were white or off-white with bold stripes, green, red, yellow, indigo, though all white and all dark versions existed as well. The stripes served no functional purpose. They were visual markers, decorative elements that also made the blanket recognizable in trade. These blankets were designed to endure. The wool was tightly spun. The weave was firm. A well-made point blanket could last years of hard use, slept under, worn as clothing, packed on horses, soaked by rain, dried by fire, folded and unfolded hundreds of times. The fabric did not easily tear. The edges were bound to prevent unravelling, and though the blankets were heavy when dry, they retained much of their insulating quality even when damp, a critical property in a climate where moisture was constant. For a mountain man spending winter in a remote cabin, a wool blanket was often his primary piece of bedding. It might be the only blanket he owned. If he had 2, he was well equipped. 3 was luxury. The blanket served double duty, sometimes triple duty, throughout the day and night. During the day, especially in the coldest months, the blanket could be worn. A man would fold it lengthwise, cut or tear a slit in the centre, and pull it over his head like a poncho. This created a garment called a capote when more formally constructed, but even a simple blanket draped over the shoulders and belted at the waist provided significant warmth. It covered the torso and arms, it blocked wind, it could be pulled up over the head as a hood, and when the day's work was done, the same blanket was removed and spread across the bed. At night, the blanket became covering. A man would lie on his bed of boughs or grass, pull the blanket over himself, and tuck the edges under his body to seal in warmth. With only a single blanket, this meant choosing: cover the upper body and leave the legs exposed, or cover the full length and accept that the blanket wouldn't wrap around completely. Many men slept curled on their sides, knees drawn up to reduce the body's surface area and make a single blanket more effective. The weight of the blanket mattered. 8 to 10 pounds of wool pressing down created a sensation of security, of enclosure. It stayed in place through the night. It didn't shift easily with movement. The heaviness itself was comforting in the profound cold, a tangible barrier between skin and the freezing air, just beyond the fire's diminishing warmth. Wool's insulating quality came from its structure. The fibres were crimped and overlapping, creating countless tiny pockets that trapped air. Once that air was warmed by body heat, it stayed relatively still, forming an insulating layer. Wool also had the unusual property of remaining warm even when wet. The fibres absorbed moisture without collapsing completely, maintaining some of their loft and air-trapping ability. In a cabin where condensation sometimes formed on walls, where snow might blow in through an imperfect chinking job, where a man might return from outside with damp clothing, this mattered. But wool required care. The blanket could not simply be used and ignored. It needed to be aired regularly. A man would take it outside on clear, cold days and shake it vigorously, letting frozen moisture fall away as ice crystals. He would hang it near the fire, not too close, to dry out accumulated dampness. He would inspect it for tears, for worn spots, for places where the weave was thinning. Small holes could be stitched, fraying edges could be rebound. A blanket carefully maintained could last 5 years or more of constant use. The point system marked on the blanket's edge indicated size in a standardized way across the fur trade network. 1 point roughly equaled 1 foot in width. When the blanket was folded in half, lengthwise, the standard way it was displayed and traded. A 4-point blanket, the most common size for individual use, was large enough to cover a man completely if used with care. A 3-point blanket was smaller, suitable for a younger person or for use as a secondary layer. Larger sizes existed, 5-point, 6-point, but these were heavier, more expensive, and often used by families or in lodges rather than by solitary trappers. The cost of such a blanket in trade terms was significant. In the 1820s and 1830s, a 4-point blanket might be worth 10 to 15 beaver pelts, depending on season and location. That represented weeks of trapping, significant labor, considerable risk. A man did not casually trade for a second blanket if his first was still serviceable, and if a blanket was lost, burned by falling too close to fire, stolen, ruined by some accident, replacing it meant hard work and sacrifice. When a trapper slept under his wool blanket on a bed of pine boughs with animal furs layered over or under it, depending on the night's temperature, he was using one of the most reliable pieces of technology available to him. It was not complicated. It was not innovative. But it was effective, durable, and proven across decades of use in conditions that destroyed lesser materials. The blanket's weight pressed down, the wool held warmth, and through the long darkness it remained constant, heavy, familiar. The same blanket that had covered him the night before, and the night before that, and on back through weeks of winter. The same blanket he would shake out in the morning, fold, and set aside until the next darkness came. When the evening fire had been built up and the last tasks completed, a mountain man turned his attention to the sleeping platform and the layers that would stand between him and cold that could kill before morning. The heaviest piece, handled with care despite months of use, was the buffalo robe. A winter-killed buffalo, taken when the coat was thickest, produced a hide that might weigh 15 to 20 pounds when tanned and dried. The fur stood dense and dark, sometimes 3 inches deep at the shoulder. The leather beneath worked soft through long processing, held body heat while blocking wind that found its way through gaps in the cabin walls. This single piece of material represented the difference between sleep and a night spent feeding the fire every hour. Buffalo robes were not common possessions. A mountain man might trade a season's worth of beaver pelts for a prime robe, or he might take a buffalo himself if he wintered in plains country where the herds ranged. The robe travelled with him, carefully protected, aired when possible, kept dry above all else. Wet fur lost its insulating capacity. Wet fur could freeze solid. Some men owned 2 robes, most owned 1. A few owned none and made do with what could be layered from other hides. Bear hides provided similar warmth when available. Grizzly fur, long and silver-tipped, could be even thicker than buffalo. But grizzlies were dangerous to hunt and less predictable to find. A man who owned a grizzly robe had either been lucky or skilled enough to bring one down and careful enough to tan the hide properly. Black bear fur was softer, less dense, better than nothing but not equal to buffalo. Beneath the top robe, or in place of it if no buffalo hide had been acquired, other furs formed layers. Beaver pelts could be stitched together into a sleeping cover. The irony was not lost on the trappers. The same pelts they risked frozen hands and frozen streams to harvest, the same furs destined for hat-making factories in St. Louis or New York, could be repurposed into bedding that trapped warmth against a man's body through mountain nights. Beaver fur was short and extraordinarily dense, designed by nature to insulate an animal in cold water. It worked nearly as well in cold air. A sleeping robe made of 12 to 15 beaver pelts sewn with sinew provided substantial warmth, but it represented significant lost income. Pelts not sold were pelts not converted to goods, ammunition, or tobacco. Most men sold their beaver and sought other solutions. Elk hides were large and available. A bull elk produced a hide that could cover a sleeping platform with material left over. The leather was thick, the hair less dense than buffalo but adequate when layered. Deer hides were thinner still but easier to obtain. 2 or 3 deer hides stacked together blocked the cold rising from below and added a layer above if needed. The arrangement of these materials followed a logic learned through necessity. The bottom layer, placed directly on the wooden platform or on top of the pine boughs and grass, was often a hide with the fur facing down. Elk or deer, something large enough to cover the sleeping area. This created a barrier. Cold moved upward through the platform. The hide disrupted that movement. Above this came the materials meant to cushion. More hides, folded blankets if available, sometimes additional pine boughs if the bedding had compressed over weeks of use. Then the sleeper himself, dressed in wool and buckskin, positioned for the night. Over the top, the primary insulating layer, the buffalo robe, or its equivalent, spread fully open, heavy enough that its weight alone created a sealed pocket of warmth. The question every man faced was which direction to turn the fur. Fur against the body provided immediate warmth. The texture against wool clothing trapped air, and the sensation, even through fabric, carried a particular comfort. Heat rose from skin and was caught in the dense fibers before it could escape. But fur against the body also absorbed moisture. Men sweated even in freezing cabins, and breath condensed in the coldest hours before dawn. Fur that took on moisture lost insulating capacity and grew heavier. If it froze, the robe became stiff, uncomfortable, and less effective. Fur facing outward, the leather side against the body, shed moisture more effectively. Condensation formed on the outer fur and could be shaken off in the morning. The smooth leather against blankets slid less, stayed in place better when a man shifted in sleep. And the fur facing the cabin air still provided insulation, creating a boundary between the warmth beneath and the cold surrounding. Some men alternated, fur inward on the coldest nights, when immediate warmth mattered most, fur outward on merely cold nights, when moisture management took priority. There was no single correct method. There was only what worked for a particular man in a particular cabin through a particular winter. Maintenance of these furs was constant, unglamorous work. Every few days, weather permitting, the robes and hides needed to be taken outside and shaken thoroughly. Ice crystals from condensation, invisible during the night but present nonetheless, would fall free. The fur would be checked for any damp spots, which, if found, meant airing the hide near the fire carefully, never close enough to singe. Hides were inspected for damage. A small tear could widen. Seams where pelts had been stitched together could separate. Repairs were made immediately, using whatever sinew or thread was available, because a gap in a robe meant a gap in warmth, and gaps compounded. Snow that made its way inside on clothing or boots had to be kept away from the sleeping furs. A man learned to brush himself clean before approaching his bedding, to keep the area near the sleeping platform as dry as the cabin allowed. When spring came and the furs were no longer needed every night, they would be cleaned thoroughly, aired for days, and stored where mice and insects couldn't reach them. A robe damaged over summer meant a winter problem months before that winter arrived. But through the dark months these hides and furs were treated with the attention they deserved. A mountain man might go days without washing. He might wear the same clothing until it fell apart. He might eat half-spoiled meat and ignore discomfort that would break a softer man. But his buffalo robe was kept dry, shaken clean, and positioned carefully every single night. It was the weight that kept him alive. The decision seemed minor until the first serious cold arrived and a man woke at midnight, shivering despite the layers around him. Then the position of every hide, the direction of every fur surface, became a problem worth solving with the same attention given to the fire or the door latch. Fur against the skin or against the wool shirt that served as the closest layer created immediate warmth through simple contact. The dense fibers trapped the air warmed by body heat before it could rise and dissipate. On the coldest nights, when temperatures outside fell into ranges that made breathing painful and turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. That immediate trapping of heat could make the difference between sleep and a miserable vigil feeding the fire. The texture itself provided comfort. There was something in the weight and softness of fur pressed close that carried a particular reassurance. A man alone for months could feel, in that pressure and warmth, something that resembled security. But fur turned inward, absorbed everything the body released during sleep. Moisture came from breath, even in a cold cabin. It came from skin, invisible but constant. Over the course of a long winter night, 10 or 12 hours of darkness, that moisture accumulated in the fibers closest to the source. Fur that seemed dry when arranged at bedtime could feel damp by dawn, particularly around the head and shoulders where breath condensed and collected. Damp fur was compromised fur. The insulation capacity dropped as water displaced air between the fibers. The robe grew heavier. And if the temperature inside the cabin fell low enough, which it often did in the hours before dawn when the fire burned to coals, that moisture could freeze, creating a stiffness that made the hide difficult to manage and uncomfortable to use. A frozen robe needed thawing. Thawing required heat, which meant fire, which meant wood consumption beyond what had been planned. The entire system of rationing and preparation could be disrupted by a hide that had taken on too much moisture. So some men learned to turn the fur outward. Leather against wool or against the blanket layer if a blanket was used meant the smooth tanned hide formed the inner surface of the sleeping system. The fur faced the cabin air. Moisture, rising from the body, passed through the fabric layers and met the leather, which was less absorbent than fur. Much of the moisture continued outward and condensed on the fur surface, where it could be shaken free in the morning. The outer fur still provided insulation. It disrupted cold air. It created a boundary layer, and it could be cleaned more easily, taken outside and beaten against a tree or the cabin wall, the ice crystals falling away like dust. But leather, against the body, even through clothing, lacked the immediate warmth of fur contact. The first hour of sleep could feel colder. The psychological comfort was different, and the hide was more likely to shift during the night, sliding across the smoother underlayers, sometimes pulling free entirely if a man turned in his sleep. There were men who swore by fur inward and managed the moisture problem through vigilance. They aired their robes more frequently. They positioned themselves farther from the fire during the evening, staying cooler so they would sweat less at night. They slept with their heads uncovered when possible, directing breath away from the furs. There were men who insisted fur outward was the only sustainable method. They tolerated the initial cold and relied on the accumulated warmth of their sleeping system, the layers beneath them, the insulated pocket of air, the banked fire still radiating heat to compensate for the lack of fur contact. And there were men who changed position based on conditions. When a storm dropped temperatures to dangerous levels and wind found every gap in the chinking, fur went inward. Immediate warmth outweighed the moisture risk because the priority was preventing cold from reaching the body's core. A damp robe could be dealt with in the morning. Hypothermia could not. When the cold was severe but stable, when the cabin held its heat reasonably well and the fire was banked with a good backlog, fur went outward. The sleeping system could function efficiently without the moisture complications. On nights that fell somewhere between, the decision was made by feel, by experience, by what had worked the week before. Beyond the primary buffalo robe or bear hide, the smaller furs and additional layers had their own orientations. Beaver pelts, sewn into a blanket-sized piece, were almost always used fur inward. The fur was too short and dense to shed moisture effectively on the outside, and its entire value came from trapping heat close. These went between the wool blanket and the body, or directly against the shirt if no blanket was available. Deer hides used as a bottom barrier, placed fur down on the sleeping platform, kept their orientation fixed. The fur against the wood helped prevent the hide from sliding, and the smooth leather surface facing up provided a base for the other layers. Elk hides large enough to serve as a top cover were usually positioned fur outward. The hair, while not as dense as buffalo, was long enough to shed ice crystals, and the large size meant they needed to stay in place through the night. Every addition to the sleeping system was a calculation: warmth versus weight, insulation versus moisture, stability versus flexibility. A man learned his own system through trial and cold correction. He learned which hides shifted and needed to be tucked beneath the edges of the sleeping platform. He learned how much fur he could tolerate against his face before breath condensation became a problem. He learned the difference between the cold that meant adding a layer and the cold that meant rebuilding the fire. The management of these materials continued even after sleep arrived. Waking in darkness to add wood to the fire, a man would assess the bedding by touch. If the top robe had shifted, he repositioned it before returning to sleep. If condensation had formed on the outer surface, he might shake the hide briefly, standing in the cold cabin in his shirt and trousers, the fur snapping in his hands, ice falling to the floor. These adjustments took seconds but mattered across hours. Morning brought a full accounting. The hides were pulled back and examined. Any significant dampness was noted. Furs that needed airing were set aside. The leather surfaces were checked for stiffness that would indicate freezing. On clear days, even in winter, the robes could be taken outside and draped over a log or branch left in what sun was available, the dry, cold air pulling moisture out more effectively than any fire. The sleeping furs were not decoration, they were not comfort items in the sense of luxury. They were insulation technology, as critical as the cabin walls and as carefully maintained as the rifle. A mountain man's survival through winter darkness rested on his ability to manage heat, to generate it, trap it, and keep it close while he slept. The direction the fur faced was part of that management, and like every other part of winter survival, it required attention, adjustment, and a willingness to learn from the cold itself. No mountain man slept naked through a Rocky Mountain winter. There were no nightshirts hung on pegs, no special garments reserved for sleep. What a man wore to bed was determined by cold, not comfort, and the assumption that he might need to move quickly if something went wrong in the night. On most winter evenings, a man went to sleep wearing much of what he had worn during the day. Wool or buckskin trousers stayed on. A long wool shirt, perhaps loosened at the collar, remained against the skin. If the night was especially cold, or if the firewood supply was uncertain, a wool cap went on before lying down. Heat escaped fastest from the head. A simple knit cap pulled low over the ears made a measurable difference. Feet required attention. Bare feet against cold air invited frostbite during sleep, especially in the hours before dawn when cabin temperatures dropped lowest. Wool socks were common. Some men wore fur-lined moccasins to bed. Others wrapped their feet in small hides or extra cloth. The goal was not comfort, but prevention. Keeping toes warm enough that circulation continued, that tissue did not freeze while the body rested. Buckskin clothing had advantages in winter sleep. Deer or elk hide, tanned and softened, did not absorb moisture the way wool did. A man perspiring under heavy furs would find wool damp by morning, cold against his skin. Buckskin stayed drier. It was durable, quiet, and layered well. Many mountain men wore buckskin trousers and wool shirts in combination, using each material where it performed best. Some men adopted Native American cold weather garments, fur-lined leggings that tied at the waist, robes that wrapped and belted, covering the torso without the restriction of a fitted coat. These styles had been refined over generations by people who lived through mountain winters as a matter of course, not as temporary isolation. A man practical enough to trap beaver was practical enough to recognize functional clothing when he saw it. The principle was layering that adjusted. A fire burning well at bedtime might make the cabin warm enough that a man slept in shirt and trousers only, one or two furs over him. As the night progressed and the fire burned lower, he might pull on his cap without fully waking. If he rose to add wood at midnight, he was already partially dressed. If something outside, a noise, a sense of threat, required investigation. He did not face the dangerous delay of dressing from bare skin. Moisture management mattered. A man sleeping directly against fur with no layer between his skin and the hide would sweat. That moisture had nowhere to go. It would dampen the fur, reduce its insulation, and leave him colder. A shirt or cloth layer acted as a barrier, wicking moisture away from skin and allowing the fur to function as intended. This was not about modesty or habit. It was thermal strategy. Clothing provided a first layer of warmth, furs provided the second. Together, they created enough insulation to survive the coldest hours. Separately, neither was sufficient. Some men kept extra layers within arm's reach of the bed, a second shirt, a hide that could be wrapped around the shoulders if cold woke them. These were not luxuries. They were tools, kept positioned and ready the same way firewood was stacked within reach. Sleep itself became part of the clothing decision. A man who knew he would wake multiple times to feed the fire dressed accordingly, enough warmth to make sleep possible, but not so much bulk that rising and moving became difficult. A man with enough firewood to last the night, confident the coals would hold until morning, might add more layers and settle deeper into his furs. The concept of night clothes as separate, lighter garments belonged to houses with steady heat and multiple rooms. In a 12-foot cabin, where interior temperature might drop 30 degrees between midnight and dawn, clothing for sleep was clothing for survival. A man dressed for darkness the way he dressed for any other threatening condition, prepared, layered, and unwilling to assume the cold would show mercy. A mountain cabin did not hold heat evenly through the long winter night. It began warm and ended cold, following a curve as predictable as the sun's arc, and a man adjusted his sleep to match it. At bedtime, with the fire built up and the evening's cooking heat still radiating from stone and clay, the cabin might reach 60 degrees. Not warm by modern standards, but tolerable, comfortable enough to move around in shirt sleeves to prepare for sleep without urgency. The air felt still rather than biting. This was the night's warmest moment. As the first hour passed, the fire began its decline. Flames shortened. The quick-burning kindling and smaller logs were consumed, leaving the larger pieces to burn slower. Heat output decreased. The cabin temperature dropped to 50 degrees, then 45. A man under his furs noticed little yet. The bedding held the warmth his body generated, insulating him from the cooling air. By midnight, the fire had burned to a bed of coals with occasional flame. Heat still radiated from the firebox, but less of it. The cabin temperature might be 40 degrees now, cold enough that breath became visible in the darkness beyond the bed. Cold enough that a man waking to add wood felt the difference immediately, the shock of air against his face, the need to move quickly. If the fire was tended at midnight, the cycle reset partially. New wood caught, flames returned, temperature stabilized or even rose slightly. But if a man chose to let the fire go, if he had built it carefully with a large backlog and believed it would hold, the cooling continued. The coldest hours came just before dawn. Outside, temperatures reached their lowest point. Inside, with the fire reduced to a dim glow of coals and ash, the cabin might drop to 30 degrees, sometimes lower. The walls, which had absorbed heat during the evening, now radiated cold inward. Frost formed on the inside of the door. Any water left in a cup or pot near the edge of the room froze solid. Under the furs, a man remained warm enough to sleep, but only just. His breath clouded heavily. The tip of his nose, exposed to air, went numb. If he shifted position and broke the seal of warm air trapped around his body, cold rushed in. He pulled the furs tighter, drew his knees toward his chest, waited for his own heat to rebuild the pocket of warmth. This temperature curve shaped every decision about night survival. A man learned to judge how much wood would be needed to carry through till dawn. He learned the feeling of cold that meant the fire needed attention versus cold that could be managed with an extra fur. He learned to distinguish between discomfort and danger. Some nights the curve was too steep. The fire burned through faster than expected. The cold outside was more severe than judged. A man woke at 3 in the morning to find the fire nearly dead and the cabin approaching freezing. Rising, then, was not a choice. It was necessity. Rebuild the fire or risk genuine cold injury before sunrise. Other nights the preparation held. The large backlog burned slowly through the darkness. The cabin cooled, but not catastrophically. A man woke at first light to coals still glowing, enough heat remaining that adding kindling brought flame back quickly. These were the successful nights when planning and experience aligned. The shift from evening warmth to pre-dawn cold happened gradually enough that sleep continued, but sharply enough that the body noticed. A man might wake briefly at intervals without fully surfacing, enough to pull another hide over himself, to adjust position, to register the cold, and decide whether it required action. This broken sleep became normal. Uninterrupted rest through a winter night was rare. Morning brought the lowest point. A man woke to a cabin colder than it had been at any point since the previous morning. The fire was embers or less. The room felt hostile. Everything required effort, leaving the furs, moving to the firebox, handling cold wood with stiff fingers, coaxing flame from coals that barely held heat. But morning also brought decision. The night had ended. A man could rebuild the fire fully, bring the cabin back to livable temperature, begin the day. The curve reversed. Heat returned. And 12 hours later, the cycle would start again. The afternoon carried its own warning. Light began to shift. Shadows stretched longer across snow. The angle of sun changed, and with it came the knowledge that preparation time was running short. A mountain man did not wait for darkness. He worked ahead of it. Firewood came first. It always came first. A man left the cabin while enough daylight remained to see clearly, moving through snow to the woodpile or to standing deadwood nearby. He gathered with intention, small pieces for kindling, dry twigs, bark, split slivers that would catch quickly from coals, medium splits for steady burning through the evening hours, and backlogs, the heavy pieces, logs as thick as a man's thigh, cut to fit the firebox, dense enough to burn slowly through long hours of darkness. The estimation mattered. Too little wood meant waking multiple times to feed a dying fire, or worse, waking to cold coals in a frigid cabin. Too much was no problem. Surplus could stay for the next night, but shortage was dangerous. An experienced man learned to read the cold. A clear night with wind meant more wood. A still night required less. Cloud cover held some warmth, open skies let heat escape. He adjusted his loads accordingly. He carried the wood inside, not left near the door, not stacked outside where he would need to open the door repeatedly in cold darkness. Inside, piled near the fireplace where it would stay dry, where snow clinging to bark could melt away, where he could reach it without leaving the warmth. Water came next. If a stream ran nearby and hadn't frozen solid, he went to it. carried a kettle or a bark container, chopped through surface ice with a hatchet if necessary, filled what he needed for the night and morning. If the stream had frozen too deep, he filled containers with clean snow, packed it down, brought it inside to melt slowly near the fire. Water inside meant no trips out in darkness, no fumbling with frozen buckets at midnight, no standing in bitter wind while filling a container with numb hands. The fire itself received attention before the meal. He built it up deliberately, added fresh wood while good light remained, let flames grow. A strong fire in late afternoon meant a bed of coals by evening, coals that would accept the night's first heavy logs without smothering, then food. The evening meal was simple, meat usually, venison or elk if the hunting had gone well, buffalo if he'd been fortunate, sometimes dried meat from autumn stores. He placed it in a pot with water, set the pot at the fire's edge or hung it from an iron hook if he had one. Let it boil slowly. If supplies allowed, beans soaked earlier, corn, wild onions gathered before snowfall, he added them. But often it was only meat and water. Simple, filling, hot. Coffee, when he had it, came in the evening, not morning. Morning could be faced without it. But evening, after a day of cold work, the dark hours approaching, coffee then was comfort. He rationed it carefully. A few precious spoonfuls of grounds, boiled strong, drunk slowly. While food cooked, he turned to other tasks, checked his traps, the ones kept inside, examined triggers, cleaned rust with a cloth, sharpened a knife that had dulled, mended a tear in buckskin leggings using an awl and strips of sinew, working by firelight and fading daylight from the small window. Some men carved, notches in a stick to count days, marks on the cabin wall. February felt longer than January, March longer still. The marks made time visible, gave it structure, proved that winter would eventually end. He inspected the door, ran a hand along its edges, feeling for gaps where wind might enter, stuffed any cracks with cloth scraps or moss, tested the latch, made sure the leather hinge hadn't stiffened too much in cold. A door that wouldn't close properly meant wind all night, meant heat loss, meant unnecessary suffering. The window, if he had one, just a small opening covered with oiled paper or scraped hide, he checked as well. The covering secured. No tears. In deep cold, some men stuffed the window entirely, choosing darkness over the cold that seeped through even treated hide. He positioned supplies within easy reach, firewood close, water container near, extra furs on the bed, ready to pull up, flint and steel where his hand could find them in darkness if the fire died completely and needed restarting. The clothing he'd wear too. Sleep, already on his body, received adjustment. Wool shirt, checked for dampness from the day's work. If damp, changed for a drier one. The damp shirt hung near the fire to dry overnight. Better to sleep in dry wool than to lie in moisture that would leach warmth all night. This preparation took time, an hour, perhaps more, but it created safety. It removed unknowns. When darkness came fully, everything needed would be within reach. No surprises, no emergencies. Just a man, a fire, and a cabin prepared for another long night. The meat boiled quietly in its pot. Steam rose, carrying the smell of food through the small cabin. A good smell, a warm smell, something that made the space feel less empty. A mountain man ate his evening meal while light still touched the sky. Not full darkness yet, but the dimming time